A billionaire kicked off a plane for no reason. A simple story, right? Just an unfortunate moment of bad luck. Wrong. Because just 20 minutes later, he didn't just get revenge, he owned the entire airline. You won't believe how it happened. But before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all around the world. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's rewind to where it all began. It was a crisp afternoon at JFK Airport, the kind of day where the terminals hummed with the steady rhythm of boarding calls and rolling suitcases. Among the sea of travelers, one man walked with a quiet confidence. His tailored charcoal suit perfectly pressed, his shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He didn't dress to impress. He didn't have to. His name was Charles Blackwood. Most people wouldn't recognize him, and that's exactly how he liked it. No flashy jewelry. No bodyguards trailing his every step. Just a man with a quiet, almost intimidating sense of presence. But beneath that unassuming exterior was a fortune worth billions, built through tech empires, ruthless acquisitions, and investments that made competitors tremble. He had the kind of wealth that could shift markets overnight. And today, that wealth was about to change the fate of an entire airline. Charles reached gate 23 for his flight to London. It was business as usual. Another flight, another deal waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. He settled into his seat in business class, opened his tablet, and started reviewing a document that would finalize yet another multi-million-dollar acquisition. That's when she arrived. Jenna. A flight attendant with 5 years of experience, sharp as a knife when it came to airline regulations. But today? Today was different. A day of delays, passenger complaints, and back-to-back flights had left her patience paper thin. And when she reached Charles's row, something about his calm, collected demeanor, something about the way he didn't immediately snap to attention, set her off. "Sir, you need to turn off your phone and put it in airplane mode," she said, her voice clipped, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. It was a routine request, one Charles had heard 1,000 times before. But he was lost in his document, his mind wrapped around numbers and contracts, and he hadn't even noticed the announcement over the PA system. So he didn't respond right away. That was her breaking point. "Sir!" Jenna's voice caught through the cabin, sharper now, carrying an edge of irritation. "I asked you to turn off your device. You need to follow the rules." Charles finally looked up. His dark eyes met hers, calm and composed, but with a flicker of something unreadable beneath the surface. He wasn't the type to make a scene. He never had to. "My apologies," he said evenly. "I'll turn it off now." But Jenna wasn't backing down. Maybe it was the stress, the exhaustion, or the small taste of power she felt in that moment, but something made her push further. "You're not taking this seriously, sir," she snapped. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." The air in the cabin went still. Charles blinked. For the first time in a long time, he was caught off guard. He had traveled to over 40 countries, conducted billion-dollar deals mid-flight, and never, not once, had anyone spoken to him like this. Passengers glanced over, eyes darting between Charles and Jenna, waiting to see what would happen next. He could have argued, could have thrown his weight around, demanded to speak to the captain. But he didn't. Instead, he did something that no one expected. He simply stood up, adjusted his cufflinks, reached for his leather carry-on, and without another word, he walked off the plane. Silence followed him down the aisle. Jenna's lips pressed into a tight, victorious line. To her, this was just another passenger put in his place. Just another name that would be forgotten by the time they landed. She had no idea what she had just done. By the time Charles stepped back into the terminal, His mind was already working at lightning speed. He wasn't angry. No, anger was for men who reacted without strategy. What he felt was something colder, something sharper, a challenge. Then his phone buzzed. A private number. One he recognized. He answered. Charles! The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, but with a weight of urgency. It was Gregory, his lawyer, his fixer, the man who made problems disappear. I heard what happened. Do you want me to handle it? Or do you want to deal with it yourself? For a moment, Charles said nothing. He was still piecing it together, still deciding exactly how he wanted to play this. Then, a slow smirk curled at the corner of his mouth. I don't want an apology, he said, his voice dangerously calm. I don't want a refund. I want control. There was a pause. Then Gregory's voice came back, this time with a trace of disbelief. Control? Charles exhaled, his decision now crystal clear. I want the airline. Every single share. I want it in my name. Make it happen. Silence stretched between them. Then, a quiet chuckle from the other end. You really want to buy the entire airline over this? Charles's grip tightened around his phone. I'm done being underestimated. Gregory didn't argue. He had worked with Charles long enough to know that when he made up his mind, nothing, no boardroom, no CO, no price tag, could stop him. Understood, Gregory said smoothly. Give me a few hours. And just like that, the wheels were set in motion. Legal teams were mobilized. Financial backers were looped in. Stock purchases started flooding the market. The board of directors had no idea what was coming for them. Jenna, sitting comfortably in business class, sipping her pre-flight coffee, had no idea that the man she had just kicked off her flight was about to become her boss. By the time the morning sun hit the Manhattan skyline, the airline CEO would wake up to find Charles Blackwood's name plastered across the headlines. And for the first time in its history, the airline would be forced to answer to him. The first news reports hit like a shockwave, rippling through the financial and aviation industries alike. Mysterious billionaire makes bid for major airline following public incident. The headline screamed, plastered across every major news outlet. Within hours, the confrontation between Charles Blackwood and the flight attendant had exploded into a full-fledged media storm. Talk show hosts dissected every second of the incident. Business analysts scrambled to understand his motives. The world was watching. But Charles? He didn't care about the headlines. He wasn't interested in the speculation, the chatter, the debates. While the media frothed at the mouth over the supposed scandal, he was already 10 steps ahead, orchestrating the most ruthless corporate takeover in airline history. His legal team had descended on the airline's board like a pack of wolves, presenting them with a deal so aggressive, so financially irresistible, that they had no choice but to listen. The airline's top executives were in chaos. CEO David Clarkson, a seasoned leader who had weathered financial crisis and labor disputes, now found himself blindsided. Sitting in his glass-walled office, he stared at the flood of notifications on his screen. Who the hell is this guy? He demanded, his voice sharp with disbelief. His CFO shifted uncomfortably. Charles Blackwood, billionaire investor, private, controls a lot of tech and real estate assets. No one's really sure how much he's worth. Clarkson's eyes narrowed. And how did he just buy up half our stock overnight? The room was silent. They had underestimated him. Assumed he was just another entitled passenger throwing a tantrum. But Charles Blackwood wasn't a man who simply took offense. He took ownership. Desperation set in as the airline's legal team worked around the clock, searching for loopholes, anything to block the acquisition. But every door they tried to open had already been locked shut. Blackwood's lawyers had drafted the terms with surgical precision, ensuring there was no escape. The takeover was happening. It was inevitable. Meanwhile, in his towering Manhattan office, Charles sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled, as he watched the financial battlefield unfold in real time. Numbers flickered across the screens in front of him, stocks shifting, assets transferring, power consolidating. He didn't need to pace or shout. This was his domain. He had calculated every move, anticipated every desperate counter. Gregory, his ever-efficient right-hand man, stood at his side, phone pressed to his ear. The call ended with a sharp nod. "It's done," Gregory confirmed, his voice steady but tinged with something close to awe. "The board just folded. The acquisition is signed. As of now, you officially own the airline." A slow smile spread across Charles's lips. He had expected it, of course. But hearing it, knowing that the very company that had once dismissed him had just been forced to surrender at his feet, that was satisfaction. But this wasn't just about revenge. No, Charles Blackwood didn't move for petty reasons. This was about making a statement, about ensuring that no one, ever again, mistook him for anything less than the force he was. And the first step in that plan? Making sure the entire world knew exactly who was in control. "Send out the press release," Charles instructed, his voice smooth, deliberate. "I want the announcement everywhere. Every news outlet, every financial publication. Make sure they print my name in bold." Gregory hesitated, glancing at him. "You sure? The media is already on fire over this. You're making a lot of waves." Charles leaned forward, the gleam in his eyes sharp as a blade. "Let them talk. Let them speculate. But make no mistake, this isn't just about an airline. This is about me. And I want them to understand one thing. No one disrespects me and walks away from it." The press release went out within the hour, and the world erupted. News anchors discussed the implications. Business insiders called it an unprecedented power move. The internet buzzed with theories, trying to dissect his motives. Some saw it as a masterstroke of corporate strategy. Others called it a billionaire's act of petty revenge. But no one could deny one thing. Charles Blackwood had just flipped the aviation industry on its head. That night, as the media storm raged, Charles made his way to the airline's headquarters. He wasn't there for meetings. He wasn't there for negotiations. No, he was there to make an entrance. The boardroom was packed with executives, men and women who had once thought they ran the company, now reduced to uneasy onlookers. When Charles walked in, silence fell. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to command attention. He took his time, walking to the head of the table, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then, with the same quiet dominance he had wielded throughout his career, he spoke. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Let's begin." Clarkson, the now former CEO, stood hesitantly. He extended a hand, forcing a strained smile. "Mr. Blackwood, we look forward to working with you. We hope to ensure a smooth transition." Charles didn't take the handshake. Instead, he met Clarkson's gaze with an unwavering stare. "I'm not here for smooth," he said coldly. "I'm here for control." The color drained from Clarkson's face. Around the table, executives exchanged nervous glances, realizing, too late, that this was no ordinary change in leadership. This was a regime change. Charles turned, heading for the door. But before leaving, he paused, delivering his final, chilling decree. "Your contracts run through the end of the week. After that, I'll be selecting new leadership." And with that, he walked out, leaving the former rulers of the airline in stunned silence. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as he stepped into the cool night air. The questions came in a barrage. What were his plans? Why had he done it? Was it revenge? Charles didn't stop. He didn't answer. He simply gave a small, knowing smile before stepping into his car. The message was already clear. By the time the world woke up the next morning, one thing was undeniable. Charles Blackwood wasn't just a billionaire. He was the man who took a single act of disrespect and turned it into an empire. And this was only the beginning. Charles leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his gaze like a blade cutting through the tense air in the boardroom. I've heard the whispers, the complaints. Employees stretched to their limits, unappreciated, undervalued. Customers treated like an inconvenience rather than the lifeblood of this airline. That ends today. His voice was calm, but the weight behind his words sent an icy ripple through the room. We will not be the airline people dread flying with. We will be the airline people seek out. One that respects its passengers, rewards its employees, and crushes any trace of mediocrity. He let the last word hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. If that sounds like too much to ask, I suggest you start updating your resumes. Because under my leadership, mediocrity isn't an option. It's a death sentence. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The executives exchanged nervous glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Charles could see the fear in their eyes, the dawning realization that this wasn't just a power move, it was a regime change. The days of complacency were over. The old guard, with their endless red tape and risk-averse stagnation, had no place in his vision. This was his empire now, and he had no intention of ruling with mercy. He outlined his demands in cold, calculated detail. Inefficiencies would be cut brutally. Customer service would undergo an overhaul so drastic that passengers would feel the difference before they even stepped on the plane. The management team? Reshuffled. Those who had let the company rot from the inside out. Expendable. He would not hesitate to tear apart the very foundation of this airline if it meant rebuilding something stronger in its place. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to dominate. When the meeting finally concluded, Charles stood, his presence towering over the shaken executives as they hurried out of the room. Some whispered frantically among themselves, others walked with their heads low, already sensing that their days were numbered. But Charles barely noticed them. His mind was elsewhere. Jenna, the flight attendant who had ignited this firestorm. The woman who had dared to challenge him, to treat him like an ordinary man when he was anything but. At first, she had been nothing more than an irritation, a momentary stain on his ego. But now she was a symbol. A reminder that people still underestimated him. That some believed they could disrespect him and escape unscathed. That belief was about to be shattered. Charles didn't act on impulse. He never did. Revenge was best served cold, calculated, and undeniable. Jenna wouldn't simply be fired. No, that was too simple, too forgettable. He needed her to feel the weight of her mistake. He needed her to understand exactly what it meant to cross him. And so, he put his people to work. Every file, every performance review, every passenger complaint against her, unearthed and analyzed. He wanted to know everything. Who she was, where she came from, what she valued, what she feared. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Jenna had clawed her way up from a small regional airline, ambitious, determined, believing she could carve out a future for herself in the industry. But with that ambition came entitlement, an arrogance that had led her to make the fatal mistake of thinking she could decide who mattered and who didn't. That day on the plane, she had wielded her authority carelessly, without a second thought. She had no idea she was playing a game far beyond her comprehension. Charles smirked. That would change soon enough. He let the days pass, allowing the anticipation to build, watching as his changes sent shockwaves through the company. Stock prices soared, operations tightened, and his presence loomed over every decision. He was everywhere. a force that couldn't be ignored. But through it all, one thought lingered, persistent, unwavering: Jenna. He envisioned the moment clearly. He wouldn't summon her privately. No, he would make sure it happened in front of her peers, in a setting where she had no control, no authority. He wanted her to feel what he had felt that day on the plane. The helplessness. The humiliation. He wanted her to look into his eyes and understand, beyond any doubt, that she had made the greatest mistake of her career. And when that moment came, when Jenna finally stood before him, stripped of the power she once wielded so recklessly, Charles would lean in, voice calm, eyes cold, and deliver the final verdict. You made a choice that day. Now, let me show you what happens when you choose wrong. There would be no escape for her. No second chances. Just the weight of her misstep crushing down, relentless and unforgiving. Because in Charles Blackwood's world, respect wasn't given, it was taken. And those who failed to understand that, they didn't get a second opportunity to learn. Charles's focus had narrowed to one singular target, Jenna. He monitored her every move without making it obvious, studying the flight schedules with a meticulous eye. He knew exactly when and where she would be working, ensuring that when the moment came, she would have no escape. It wasn't just about retaliation, it was about control, about demonstrating that no one, no matter how small, could challenge him without facing the consequences. The perfect opportunity arrived sooner than expected. Charles had just stepped out of a high-level meeting with one of his financial backers when the news reached him. Jenna had been assigned to a high-profile flight, one attended by media personnel, industry executives, and VIPs. It was the kind of flight where every detail was scrutinized, where service was expected to be flawless. Charles felt a slow, calculated smile spread across his face. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The stage was set, and Jenna would have no idea that she was about to be the lead in a carefully orchestrated downfall. The press had been hounding the airline since Charles's takeover, eager to capture the drama unfolding under his rule. He knew that whatever happened on this flight would be news, and he intended to use that to his full advantage. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone, calling his head of operations. I want PR representatives on that flight, he ordered, and have security monitoring the situation. Quietly. His voice was as sharp as a blade. Make sure everything goes exactly as planned. That evening, the airport terminal was buzzing with its usual chaos, but Charles walked through it like a ghost in the storm, untouched, unmoved. His presence alone commanded attention. Airline staff glanced up, recognizing him instantly, and quickly averted their gazes, afraid to linger too long in his shadow. He didn't need theatrics to establish dominance. His mere existence was enough to send ripples of unease through the air. And then he saw her. Jenna stood among a cluster of flight attendants, her arms crossed, her expression tight with frustration. She was in the middle of a disagreement with another crew member over a last-minute change to the flight schedule. Charles observed, silent and patient. The tension in her posture, the clipped tone in her voice, it was all fuel for what was to come. He had no intention of making this easy for her. This wasn't about firing a flight attendant. This was about sending a message. Jenna turned slightly, catching sight of him, and for a brief second, her composure cracked. He saw it, saw the flicker of recognition, the moment of panic before she forced her features into a professional mask. She straightened, offering a polite, measured smile. Mr. Blackwood, she greeted, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. Is there something I can do for you? Charles didn't bother with pleasantries. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable, his voice low and precise. Jenna, he said, letting her name hang in the air. We need to talk. Her throat bobbed slightly as she swallowed, but she held her ground. Of course. What about? He didn't blink. about respect, about consequences. The other flight attendants stepped back instinctively, sensing the weight of the moment. A heavy silence settled over the group. Jenna exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the edge of her uniform. "If this is about that flight, Charles cut her off with a simple lift of his hand. "You made a choice," he stated. "You thought you were in control of that situation. You weren't." His tone was eerily calm, each word deliberate. "And now, you're going to understand what it means to cross the wrong person." Jenna's expression hardened. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," Charles repeated, his eyes dark with amusement. "Your job is to serve this airline, to represent this airline. And yet, you chose to treat me as if I was nothing. Do you think I'd let that slide?" Jenna inhaled, her jaw tight. "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't aware that enforcing airline policy was grounds for. You're relieved of your duties." The word struck like a hammer. Jenna froze. "What?" Charles leaned in slightly, just enough to ensure his words sank in. "You no longer work here. HR has already been informed. Your termination will be handled quietly, out of respect. But let me be clear, Jenna." He lowered his voice just enough that only she could hear the next part. "I don't tolerate defiance. I don't tolerate arrogance. And I certainly don't tolerate people who underestimate me." Jenna's face was a mixture of shock, anger, and humiliation. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Around her, other crew members stood in rigid silence, unwilling to move, unwilling to intervene. Charles took a step back, regarding her with a final, piercing stare. "Let this be a lesson," he said coldly. "Not just for you, but for everyone watching." And then, without another glance, he turned and walked away. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, whispers spread through the airline like wildfire. The press caught wind of the termination, and soon, Jenna's abrupt departure was making rounds in the news cycle. Some called Charles ruthless. Others called him a genius. But no one, not a single person, doubted the message he had sent. For Charles, this was more than a power move. It was a declaration. A warning. To his employees, his competitors, even the world itself. Charles Blackwood was not a man to be challenged. And Jenna? She was just the first to learn that lesson the hard way. The media storm that followed only fueled Charles's momentum. While journalists debated the morality of his decision, while former employees whispered in hushed voices, he remained focused on his ultimate goal: power. The airline stock continued to rise. Its operations became more efficient, and those who remained in his ranks quickly learned that survival meant unwavering loyalty. But Charles wasn't done. He knew the world had a short attention span. They would eventually forget Jenna's name, just as they had forgotten so many before her. That's why he had to keep pushing, keep evolving, keep dominating. And that's exactly what he intended to do. So, as the news cycles moved on, and the dust settled, Charles was already planning his next move. Because in his world, there was only one rule: never stop winning. The room was so still it felt like time itself had paused. The weight of Charles Blackwood's words loomed over the executives, suffocating the air with unspoken tension. He stood at the front of the room, his presence alone demanding unwavering attention. His gaze swept across the gathered leadership team, each individual shifting uneasily under his scrutiny. "We've made a lot of changes already," he continued, his voice controlled but brimming with authority. "And we will continue to do so." He let the words sink in before taking a calculated pause, his eyes narrowing. "I've begun a full review of our leadership team. Some of you will be stepping into new roles. Others," he let the silence hang, thick and ominous, "will be leaving." The unspoken threat crackled through the air like a live wire. Charles tilted his head slightly, studying the expressions in the room. Some faces remained impassive, others barely masked their anxiety. He wanted them to feel this moment, to understand that this was not a warning, it was a certainty. "You've had your chance," he continued, voice unwavering. "If you want to stay, you'll prove to me that you are all in. If not," he offered a faint smirk, void of humor, "I'm sure you'll find other opportunities elsewhere." A heavy silence followed. No one dared to speak, no one dared to question him. They understood. Charles had made it clear. This was his airline now, and there would be no place for complacency, no room for anyone who didn't align with his vision. Those who had once skated by on past achievements would either adapt or disappear. He let the tension linger before delivering his final blow. "One more thing." His voice was softer now, which somehow made it even more unsettling. "I don't want to hear any more stories of any employees, being treated with disrespect." He took a slow step forward, letting his gaze settle on a few key individuals. "This is a company that values people, not just profits. And I will not tolerate anyone undermining that." His final words sliced through the silence like a blade. "Understood?" The response was immediate. A collective nod rippled through the room. No hesitation. No resistance. Just obedience. That was how he knew he had them. As the meeting concluded, people filed out in hushed tones, whispering among themselves, their minds racing. Charles remained still, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. The turning point. No one could deny his authority now. He had reshaped not just the airline, but the entire culture of the company. His influence was absolute. But this was only the beginning. The days turned into weeks, and Charles continued to tighten his grip. His vision was no longer just an idea. It was a reality. Employees who had once coasted through their jobs were now pushing themselves harder, driven by either ambition or sheer fear of being cut. The old culture of mediocrity was crumbling, replaced by efficiency, precision, and unwavering discipline. Those who couldn't keep up, they were removed without hesitation. Yet, amidst his triumph, one thought lingered in the back of his mind like a splinter he couldn't quite remove: Jenna. Her face, her defiance, haunted him. Even after her public downfall, after she had been stripped of her position, there was something unfinished. The moment of her firing had been satisfying, but not enough. Not for Charles. He had built an empire on control, on ensuring that those who crossed him understood their mistakes. And Jenna? She was the reason all of this had started. It wasn't revenge he wanted. No, this was something far greater. This was about rewriting history, about making sure that when people thought of Jenna Richards, they thought of the woman who dared to stand against Charles Blackwood, and lost. She had been the spark, but he would be the wildfire that consumed everything she had ever known. Charles was not a man who left loose ends. He had the resources, the power, and the influence to ensure that Jenna would never find her footing again. With a few keystrokes, he could alter the course of her future permanently. And that's exactly what he planned to do. He called in his PR team. "I want a full breakdown of her life since leaving the airline," he instructed, his voice cold and methodical. Within hours, they returned with what he expected. Jenna was struggling. No airline would touch her. Her reputation had taken a hit, whispers of her insubordination spreading through the industry like a slow-moving plague. But that wasn't enough. Charles wanted to make sure she never worked in the skies again. He turned to his legal team next. "Make it official," he ordered. "Find a way to make sure her name is blacklisted across the industry. Quietly, but permanently." They did as he asked. Strategic letters were sent to key decision-makers, carefully crafted to paint Jenna as a liability. She was branded as unprofessional, insubordinate, a risk no airline could afford. Every application she sent was met with silence. Every door she knocked on remained closed. Her career didn't just stall, it crumbled. And just like that, Jenna Richards ceased to exist in the industry she had once loved. Meanwhile, Charles thrived. His airline soared to new heights, stock prices climbing, competitors scrambling to match his pace. He had transformed a moment of disrespect into an empire built on his rules. He was the architect of this new reality, and he made sure the world knew it. Sitting in his office one afternoon, reviewing the latest financial reports, a smirk played across his lips. He had done it. He had not only taken control of an airline, he had taken control of destiny itself. And as for Jenna, she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The takeover was swift, ruthless, and inevitable. Charles Blackwood didn't waste time with drawn-out negotiations or pointless bargaining. He wasn't a man who played by anyone else's rules. He made an offer so undeniably lucrative, so surgically precise, that the smaller airlines board had no choice but to surrender. Within weeks, the papers were signed, the ink dried, and another company bid to his will. It wasn't just another acquisition, it was a statement, a warning, a declaration to the entire aviation world. Charles Blackwood took what he wanted, and he took it fast. With the new airline under his control, Charles wasted no time in implementing his vision. His most trusted executives descended like a pack of wolves, dissecting every aspect of the company and molding it into his empire. Policies were rewritten. Leadership was gutted. Anyone who couldn't keep up with the brutal pace of change was discarded. Resistance wasn't tolerated. The airline's old culture, its familiar ways, were annihilated and rebuilt in his image. Some called it efficiency. Others called it tyranny. But Charles didn't care what they called it, only that they understood one thing: adapt or be crushed. Of course, no takeover was without resistance. Internal power struggles erupted, longtime employees pushed back, and whispers of dissent circulated through the ranks. But Charles didn't flinch. He thrived on challenges. Where others saw obstacles, he saw opportunities to assert control. With relentless precision, he crushed the opposition, eliminating anyone who stood in his way. Within months, the transition was complete. The airline was bigger, stronger, and more profitable than ever. Investors lined up like hungry vultures, eager to profit from Charles's aggressive expansion. The stock soared, the press sang his praises, and competitors scrambled to keep up. But even as he stood at the pinnacle of success, there was one loose end Charles had yet to tie up. Jenna. The woman who had unknowingly set this entire saga into motion. He had ruined her career, ensured she'd never set foot on another plane as a flight attendant, but somehow, that wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to make sure the lesson stuck, not just for her, but for the entire world. Sitting alone in his office, the city's skyline stretching endlessly beyond his window, Charles swirled a glass of scotch in his hand. The acquisition had been a success. His empire was thriving. And yet, an unshakable restlessness gnawed at him. Jenna's face, her defiant eyes, the way she had dismissed him as just another passenger, it was an itch that refused to fade. She hadn't just insulted him, she had underestimated him. And for that, he needed to make sure her downfall was absolute. With a slow, calculated breath, Charles began to plan. Destroying her career had been just the first step. Now, he would erase any chance of redemption. He called in his legal team, his PR strategists, his most trusted operatives. "Make sure she stays blacklisted," he instructed, his voice like ice. "No airline, no company in this industry gives her a second chance." But that wasn't enough. He wanted her name to be synonymous with failure. He reached out to his media connections, planting stories that painted her as a liability, a reckless, insubordinate employee who had single-handedly thrown away her career. Articles appeared in business journals, aviation blogs, news websites, all subtly reinforcing the same narrative. Jenna Richards wasn't just unemployed. She was unemployable. As the weeks passed, the whispers turned into truths. Her name became a cautionary tale in industry circles, a prime example of what happened when someone defied Charles Blackwood. No airline, big or small, would touch her. Recruiters steered clear. Doors slammed shut before she could even knock. And still, Charles wasn't satisfied. The victory felt hollow. The power, the dominance, the control, it was all his. And yet, as he sat in the solitude of his towering office, he felt a strange, gnawing emptiness creeping in. He had spent years chasing power, dismantling anyone who dared stand in his way, reshaping industries, and bending people to his will. He had won. But for the first time, he asked himself, what came next? The adrenaline that had once fueled him, the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of crushing his enemies, it all felt less. The fire that had driven him through battle after battle was burning lower, flickering in a way he didn't quite understand. Charles found himself staring at the towering skyline beyond his window, the endless sea of success stretching before him. He had everything: money, power, influence. And yet, a question lingered in the back of his mind, one he wasn't ready to answer. Was it enough? As the days stretched into weeks, that question haunted him. The empire he had built, the victories he had claimed, what did they mean if, in the end, they left him feeling empty? He had won every battle. But standing at the peak of his empire, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, he had lost something much greater. Charles leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as he stared out over the city skyline. The towering buildings, the pulsing life below, the world that had once seemed like a playground for his ambition, it all felt different now. Hollow. He had won, hadn't he? He had taken everything he wanted, crushed every obstacle in his path, and built an empire that no one could challenge. And yet, here he was, drowning in the very success he had chased so relentlessly. Jenna. Her name echoed in his mind like a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. At first, his war against her had been about proving a point, about ensuring that no one, no matter how insignificant, would ever dare to cross him. But now, with the dust settled and the battle long over, he was left with a question that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Was it worth it? He had reduced her career to ashes, made her name a cautionary tale in the industry. But what had he really gained? Power? Respect? Or just a deeper void inside himself? The realization hit him like a gut punch. He had become something he never intended to be. He had built his empire on victories, but those victories had no meaning anymore. If he wasn't chasing the next conquest, if he wasn't proving himself over and over again, then what was he? He had spent years defining himself by the battles he fought, the rivals he crushed, but now there were no more enemies left. Just him, alone with his thoughts, haunted by the life he had built. The reports on his desk blurred as he pushed them aside. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the numbers, the profits, the stock market fluctuations. None of it mattered if he didn't know what he was fighting for anymore. He needed something more than power. He needed purpose. For the first time in years, Charles considered something that had never once crossed his mind: stepping back. Not forever. Not even for long. Just enough to figure out what the hell he was doing with his life. He had the resources to disappear for a while, to leave the boardrooms and the endless strategy meetings behind, to breathe in something other than the stale air of corporate warfare. The idea of a break felt foreign to him. Sitting still had never been in his nature. But now, the thought of stepping away didn't feel like weakness, it felt like survival. And so, before he could talk himself out of it, he made the decision. A week later, Charles found himself on a secluded Caribbean island, surrounded by nothing but the endless horizon and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. It was a world away from the steel and glass empire he had built, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe. He walked barefoot on the sand, read books he had abandoned years ago, and met people who didn't care about who he was or what he had built. They saw him as just another man, not as Charles Blackwood, the ruthless tycoon. But even here in paradise, his mind refused to let go completely. At night, as he sat on the balcony overlooking the ocean, the nagging feeling persisted. The problem wasn't his success. It wasn't the business. It was him. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped building for the sake of creation and started playing a different game, a game of control, of dominance, of power for power's sake. He had become a prisoner of his own empire. And for the first time, he wondered, could he start over? Could he take the foundation he had built and create something better, something that wasn't driven by ego or revenge but by real purpose? The thought was terrifying, but also liberating. By the time he returned from his trip, something had shifted. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had clarity. He couldn't keep living like this, chasing empty victories, crushing people just because he could. It wasn't sustainable. It wasn't who he wanted to be. For the first time, he thought about the people who had stood by him. The employees who had given everything to help him build his empire. The ones he had always seen as assets, not as people. What if the true value of his company wasn't in its profits, but in the people who made it run? And so, Charles did something that stunned his executives. He started making changes, not for profit, not for dominance, but for something deeper. He launched leadership programs, invested in mentorship, and gave employees real opportunities to grow. He pushed for corporate responsibility initiatives, making the airline not just a business, but a force for good. His board members were skeptical. His closest allies questioned him. But slowly, they saw the shift. This wasn't the Charles Blackwood they had known, the man who ruled with an iron fist. This was someone different. Someone who wasn't just trying to win, but trying to build something that lasted. But the transformation wasn't just in the business, it was in Charles himself. He reconnected with old friends, spent time with family, volunteered for causes he had ignored for years. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could build a future that wasn't defined by conquest, but by meaning. As he looked out over his empire, he no longer felt the emptiness that had plagued him for so long. He would never forget the moment that had set everything in motion, the flight attendant who had dared to defy him. But now, instead of seeing her as an enemy, he saw her as something else, the catalyst for his own transformation. And that, he realized, was the real victory. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this. See you in the next one.